Hi, I'm Tommy George, and this is Crash Course World History. Today, we're going to be talking about Mesoamerican and Andean civilization. For those of you who aren't familiar with post-classical South America, it is located around here. Nailed it. Ah, globes. You know, I always say a historian is measured by the quantity of his globes. Too much of a good thing, Steve! Between 12,000 and 400 BCE, a civilization known as the Olmec rose to power in what is modern-day Mexico. This civilization began when powerful families took land in the region. 3 centers with extensive long-distance trade were established, although the great cities housed the elite and not the workers. The workers and farmers lived outside the cities. Evidence of this civilization can be found in artifacts that are left behind from the works of artisans from this time. This civilization also created really big heads, and when I say really big heads, I mean really big heads. They weighed in excess of 30 tons and were 5 through 11 feet. They were presumed to be portraits of Olmec priests, or perhaps rulers, or perhaps both. In addition, the Olmec people were the champions of a sport known as sacrificial baseball. And no, Steve, I am not making this up. While it was more of a game of hacky-sack, the captain of the losing team would be sacrificed. While amusing, this practice indicated the beginnings of a religion that was very characteristic to the Mesoamerican and to an extent Andean regions. Astronomers were also very celebrated in Olmec culture. They developed a calendar and named the months after agricultural seasons, and observed planetary processes. Now, all this talk of cosmology and calendars reminds me of our good friends the Maya, who are very near and dear to our hearts since the come of the apocalypse recently. Now, according to their creation myth, the Mayan civilization was founded by a pair of twins who fought the very gods of hell themselves in sacrificial baseball. They happened to win, and so they were like, hey, let's make a civilization, because who wouldn't want to do that? Now, this is of course coming from the same people who thought all the universe was on the back of a giant turtle, so we're gonna say it's dubious at best. Historical sources tell us that in alliance with Toltec warriors, a group of Olmec were able to establish a new capital in Chichen Itza, and thereby found a new civilization. This civilization would grow to include much of the Yucatan Peninsula, and today we call it the Maya. The Maya were able to domesticate plant foods such as root vegetables and beans and...
Mr. George?
What?
How did the Roman Empire get split in half?
How?
With a pair of Caesars.
Me from the past, that joke was amazingly corny. See what I did there? Anyway, they're almost as corny as our friends, the Mayans. The Mayans believed that they themselves were created by the gods out of corn, and the colors of maize, red, white, yellow, and black, were sacred to them. The Mayans were devoted to a pantheon of animistic gods, and many lords and kings kept their divine right through a series of bloodletting rituals to prove their loyalty to the divine. In addition to their fixation with the gods was an obsession with cosmology. They were able to establish a 365-day solar year, which was divided into 18 28-day months, and a 5-day liminal period called Xmac Akabi Nob, or something like that. This calendar did not extend past 2012, but seeing as they were an ancient civilization, it was still rather impressive. Now, the collapse of the Mayans has been the topic of fervent debate among historians. Maybe it was famine, drought, disease, or labor shortages that led to the breakdown of their agricultural economy. Maybe there were invaders, or maybe there were dinosaurs, or dragons. We don't really know what happened to the Maya, but the Maya still claimed to know how we would end. The origins of the Toltec civilization are largely unknown. However, we know they began as a collection of small rural towns. They were able to establish their first capital by the year 650, although they intentionally burned it down for some reasons shortly after. They later established a capital at Tula in 968, which lasted a bit longer. This civilization was agriculturally based and depended on maize and root vegetables, and they manufactured jade, textiles, and art inspired by warfare, which they were able to connect to an extensive trade network in the region. They were also among the first Mesoamericans to have metal, which led to both military and economic advantages. By 1150, the civilization had a mysterious downfall, but this did allow power to shift to the valleys and shores of lakes in Mexico. In 1325, Nahuatl-speaking peoples migrated to the shores of Lake Texcoco and formed the city of Tenochtitlan. This was the beginning of Aztec civilization. Under the leader Itzcoatl, by 1428 they consolidated independent power, and they defeated the Tepechecs at the Mexica Basin. They built temples and roads and established a system through which they passed leadership, brother to brother and father to son. Within that system, leaders were chosen by the priests and politicians, and this was based on skill in battle as well as eloquence at speaking. By 1434, the Aztec people made a military alliance with two other city-states and dominated all others in the region. They expanded rapidly under the leadership of Montezuma and adopted the gods of the region. Most important was the god of sun and warfare, Huitzilopochtli. Oh look, it's time for the open letter. Magic. An open letter to Huitzilopochtli.
Huitzilopochtli.
Wheat pasta.
Huitzilopochtli.
Steve, how many times do I have to tell you mispronouncing things is my thing? Now, let's see what's in the secret compartment. Oh look! Iconography. Both of these, this mask and this little golden man, are icons from the Aztec era that represent Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and warfare. Now, something you may not have noticed about Huitzilopochtli is that his name has a lot of syllables in it. Perhaps the Aztecs judged the power of their gods based on the number of letters in their name. But the most remarkable thing about Huitzilopochtli is perhaps that, despite how complicated his name is to say, so many Aztecs loved saying it. There was a whole priestly class at the top of the social order, and it was their job to say that name every morning and every night. And the peasants said the name as they farmed, and the warriors as they went to war. The entire Aztec nation was practically walking around going, Huitzilopochtli! And this just goes to show their dedication to suffering through the 8 syllables of that word. Don't check me on that, Steve! Shows the devotion of the Aztecs to their deities. And if we are to understand this alien civilization that is by no means what we accept as standard Western civilization, we must understand that icons like this and this meant the entire world to these people. Best wishes, Tommy George.
Mr. George, didn't the Aztecs go crazy and kill people?
Well, yes and no, me from the past. This is a rather complex question, so let's go to the thought bubble to find out. Our story begins on a warm Mexican day. A group of Aztec warriors are marching to battle in what is known as a flowery war, a conquest commissioned by priests for the goal of taking human sacrifices.
The sacrifices are then brought to Aztec capitals, where they will be sacrificed in the glory of the gods. Now, these flowery wars commissioned by the priests show how religion was able to inspire conquest in Aztec civilization. More war meant more sacrifice.
Religious ceremony was a function of the Aztec government, which also controlled much of the civilization's economy. Sophisticated state-planned irrigation projects allowed an agricultural base to the economy, and chinampas, which were floating gardens, provided fertile land for growing crops even in the middle of lakes. Farmers, who were a majority of the Aztec population, had something to grow, even though Mexico had a relatively dry climate. In fact, we're beginning to notice a pattern here. Many of the successful civilizations did in fact have an agricultural base. Unless, of course, you are, wait for it, the Mongols. In addition to agriculture, the Aztecs had a successful textile production, which was mostly comprised of richly decorated clothing made by women. Also, the Aztecs were characterized by abundant gold, which would later make them the envy of some European civilizations that came to conquer them, because what else does Europe do? Anyway, a civilization that is so drenched in the blood of human sacrifice has proven in this way that it can have great prosperity as well, great success, and great happiness for the majority of its people when they're not tongue-tied over saying Huitzilopochtli. However, by the 1600s, the Aztec Empire was heading south. Now, speaking of heading south, let's switch to camera 2 and talk about Andean civilization. Hello, camera 2. Now, the remnants of Andean civilization can be found in the Chavín de Huántar temple complex. This temple complex is both a visually and spiritually powerful symbol of this ancient civilization. Temples such as the Chavín de Huántar were sites for the worship of many of the Chavín's polytheistic gods. Worship of these gods was facilitated by a class of priests, who enjoyed a position at the top of Chavín society, and they exerted great authority over the people. As heads of Chavín society, priests also played a large economic role. They controlled the flow of goods in the agricultural economy of the Chavín. Devotion to the gods and to the priests inspired a lot of public service projects, such as constructing temples, like the Chavín de Huántar. Many of the workers were paid in food, such as the root crops and potato that were grown in Andean soils. Now back to camera 1. Oh, look! A cupcake left by Taylor the intern. Thanks, Taylor. Now, as I was saying, the cultural and agricultural achievements of the Chavín are noteworthy. But perhaps their greatest achievement was laying the foundations for the establishment of the Incan Empire. Take a moment to imagine a world without any of these books. Yes, that's right. The Andean civilization did not have a system of writing. Instead, they had quipu, which were ropes with knots in them that kept records. However, despite all this, the Incans were able to establish a great empire that was ruled through a mix of absolute rule, theocratic power, and a centralized bureaucratic state. Incan civilization had its origin in the region of Cusco. Cusco, of course, is where we get the name of the emperor in The Emperor's New Groove. Anyway, around Cusco were various regional kingdoms and groups in the 13th century, but through a pattern of conquest, they were able to establish a rather unified state by 1400. A lot of this conquest was led by a leader known as Pachacuti, who was famous for his implementation of cooties in warfare.
No, he didn't.
Steve, why you gotta make history so boring all the time? Anyway, Pachacuti was known as the reformer of the world and savior of the earth. And from the point of view of the Incans, this was actually a rather well-founded name for him. He was able to lead the Incan armies in conquest of groups of cultural diversity and unify them into an empire. Once the Incans had established a rather large territory, they needed a way to govern this territory. This was done ultimately by the predominance of a divine right king, known as the Sapa Inca. Under this king was a system known as the Tuani Tsuyu, which means 4 parts together. Each part was governed by an Apo, and this Apo would generally have contact with the Sapa through exchanges of gifts and tribute. Land in the Incan Empire was divided in a tripartite fashion. There was the land of the rulers himself, the Sapa Inca, the lands of the sun, which were governed by priests, and the land of the subject peoples. A lot of the tribute for the empire was extracted from the subject peoples, and this was allowed by a almost socialistic social order. The basic unit of this social order was the Ailu, kinship and religious-based groups. From these groups, tribute was extracted in the form of the mita, which was the work draft. Workers would be taken for a couple months of the year in order to work on large projects, such as temples or palaces. In exchange for this, they would receive a lot of food and provisions from the state.
Mr. George, what was the role of women in the Incan economy?
Thank you, me from the past. That was an uncharacteristically insightful question. You know, sometimes I do forget that you are actually me. So, women. The women in the Mita work draft situation provided fabrics that were used in a lot of religious ceremonies at the temples. Now, a lot of society was able to be incorporated into this socialistic order because this diverse region was fully incorporated into Incan culture. A lot of this was achieved through forced migrations and the establishment of a universal language. Equally important was an efficient system of roads and tambo shacks for llama travelers to rest in. Even without the advanced technology that made the West the focus of far too many history textbooks, I'm looking at you, Peter N. Stearns! The Incan civilization was able to dominate a region of diverse kingdoms and impose a sophisticated culture, economy, and social order. For that, they must be remembered. It is now clear that civilization in Andia and Mesoamerica was remarkably advanced. However, their downfall can best be described by this Mayan proverb. It is not wise to put a basket on your head, as you will be eaten by a dog. Similarly, this entire civilization had a basket over their collective heads, and the dogs of Western civilization, in the forms of explorers in ships, were fast on their heels. Just as the Aztecs and the Toltecs and the Inca supported their civilization through a series of conquest and sacrifice, these civilizations were sacrificed on the altars of the West so that our civilization can exist. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Steve Schwab. The associate producer is Deannica DePoe. The show is written by my high school history classmates and myself. The show is ably interned by Taylor Murphy, and the graphics team is Thamina Shafiula. Last week's Phrase of the Week was Danny Boy. To take a guess at this Phrase of the Week or suggest future ones, you can comment below, where you can also ask questions about today's video, which will be answered by our team of historians. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as they say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.